Good evening. Some of you are wondering who the person is that doesn't have a name. Well, I guess that was me. I told my wife, I said, if you put my name in, probably nobody will show up. And you know the way Church House looked when we started, I thought that was the case because there was no name in and people weren't here. But thankfully, people did show up anyway. The subject that was assigned to me is salvation, death, and redemption. Now you're smiling at me again because, well, anyway, it was one that none of you chose, so we go back and pick it up, I guess. But it was fairly high on the list. But I do thank all of you that chose a topic and fulfilled your responsibility. I appreciated that. So I don't know if this one is more difficult or just you chose something else, then I guess that's okay. Because I'm not sure if I should say it or not. The one that does the bulletin put this in the bulletin, and so I consented to take it. So thanks anyway. So our subject tonight, I had to think, last time it was on the triune God. It was about the Godhead, which is 3 in 1. But it still comes down to one. The Godhead is one. And this time our subject, I guess, has 3 subjects, and we'll try to combine it into one. I had to wonder, I guess looking at this salvation, death, and redemption, it all depends what angles you want to approach it, I guess, which one comes first. But I guess tonight I'm going to look at death first, and then salvation, and then redemption. And these 3 are all very interconnected. That's my opinion, at least. I mean, it could be addressed separately. But the question that I was thinking about today is what is there about death that it needed to be addressed as a doctrine? If you look in the doctrines of the Bible, it has the list of doctrines there, and I looked up the word doctrine in Nelson's Bible Dictionary, and it said a body of beliefs about God, man, Christ, the church, and other related concepts considered authoritative and thus worthy of acceptance by all members of the community of faith. Of course, there's a longer write-up there, but it says that the earliest doctrine of the Christian church declared, and there's 3 of them. Number 1 is that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, and that was number 1. The second one is that God had raised him from the dead, or the resurrection. And the third one is that salvation was by faith in his name. And those are 3 very basic principles of doctrine. Now that I've said that much, what is a doctrine? What's another word for doctrine? We just use it. The word, what does it mean? It's rather simple. It's instruction. But it's important instruction. So as we think of death, as I said, I guess I thought about this a bit today, and I wonder if it'd be wrong to come up here and say, well, I thought about death so much today that I'm excited about it. Would that be wrong? How many of us are excited about death? Probably all of you that have had little children, you've had to answer questions about death. Was death in God's original plan? No, I would agree with that. But obviously, did God know it was going to happen? Genesis 2, verse 17 says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." So why did God say that? Giving man a choice. God made us creatures of choice. And I guess it's like when you as parents, you send your children out to do something and you give them some warnings. I mean, look out for whatever, the pitfalls and whatever you're going to encounter that day. But God told them, specifically, gave them instructions, and he said, if you eat of this one tree, he said, you're going to die. So that's where death was introduced. And of course, we know the story. And Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, where God told Adam and Eve, he said, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Did Adam and Eve die when they ate from that tree?
I think the process of death started right then.
There was a spiritual death that took place. Because had they died physically, where would they have been? They would have been separated from God. There was a spiritual death that took place immediately. How old were Adam and Eve when they sinned?
24 and a half.
24 and a half, okay. Can you back that up? But I like your guess. You know, up until that point, I don't think they ever needed to visit a doctor. There was no vaccines needed. They were in perfect health. But I believe that immediately changed. I believe that's where sickness and the result of the process of dying started. So if your children ask you, why do people die? I mean, why is there death? Well, we say, well, people die from old age. I think it was last Saturday, just in our local community, there was a 99-year-old person was buried. And of course, we all know that this past week there was a 90-year-old person buried here. It's a result of old age, right? That's what death is. Any comments on that? Why do people die? Why is there death?
Because of the curse brought about by sin. No matter what the method or the means of death, the reason for death would be sin.
So now we have no guarantee. I said a 99-year-old person was buried, a 90-year-old person was buried. We have no guarantee of living till 90 or 99. I think this last week I saw an obituary of a 53-year-old man, died unexpectedly. And I believe this last week also a 64-year-old man. And there's been lots of others. I'm just pointing out other ages. How do you explain to your children when children die? Innocent children. It's still because of the curse. It's not because of individual sin, but it's because of the curse that we face death.
It's the vehicle that God chooses to use to move man from life to his eternal abode. It's, we call it a process. But, we couldn't come to God without dying.
So death is a judgment, but in reality it's also a, not sure what term to use, an act of mercy. If Adam and Eve, in their dying state, after they sinned, would still live eternally on this earth, can you imagine? I think I can use an example that is right here. Those of you that viewed Katie's body noticed the deformity of her body. Can you imagine somebody that would just go on living, just on and on and on in a state of deterioration in our physical body? It's an act of mercy that God has chosen to relieve this body through death. and to translate us into a place that none of us has seen. And it said he'll give us a new body where there's no sin, no curse. Job said, he said, "For I know that thou wilt bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living." Does it do us good to live in that consciousness of death? Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 5, he says, "For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." I'll let you explain the latter part of the verse. I'm not going into that tonight, but he says, "For the living know that they shall die." It's the part that I wanted this evening. So death is a judgment upon sin. Paul said that death is an enemy. So now can you explain that? We just said that death is actually an act of mercy. What does death do to us that we consider it an enemy? It separates. Do you ever see a separation that didn't bring pain? And that of this nature? It separates body and soul. It separates loved ones. It brings separation. But Paul said that death is the last enemy that shall be destroyed. Romans 5:12 says, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." I don't believe it was only coincidence, but I guess it was a matter of choice that Adam and Eve both sinned. I mean, you can let your imagination wonder, what if only Eve would have sinned? Well, it didn't happen, so we don't even need to bother imagining that. So all of us today, alive today, and all of the people that have lived after Adam and Eve inherited the sin nature. It says, "By one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. So death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." So you can go back to the book of Genesis, if you please, in Genesis chapter, well, actually, I believe the first death was recorded in Genesis chapter 3 when Abel was killed. And we would call that a premature death, I guess. Then you go into Genesis chapter 5, and it starts going down through the patriarchs, I believe they're called. A lot of them lived to be 800-900 years old, and it says they all died. Not a one of them is living today. They all died. So what is it about death that we maybe sometimes we ask questions about, or that we don't understand? Are there people out there that don't have a right concept of death, or do we struggle with that sometimes? Is death the end for the soul? See heads going this way, and I believe Michael said no. You could, and you well remember the account in Luke chapter 16, verse 22 of the rich man and Lazarus. Death was not the end for the soul. I believe there's atheists that would like to claim that. They would say that there is no God and that death is the end. And they would like to claim that. They would like to believe that. Whether they actually believe that, I can't speak for them. But death is not the end. And then there's all kinds of other kinds of beliefs, I guess, and I didn't research a lot. There's those that would believe that the wicked are annihilated or simply eliminated after judgment. And we have scriptures in Mark chapter 9, verse 44, it says, "Where their worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched." And Jude chapter 1, in Jude, in verse 6 and verse 13, you can read those verses, and it says that God will reserve them unto the day of judgment. That The soul is not annihilated, but our souls are eternal. Question I have then for each one of us, do we need to fear death? Then why do we run from it? I believe God has put a healthy fear within each one of us that we desire to live. But I had to think, really the one that conquered death, he's the first one that I can remember reading about that he actually embraced death. His captors came into the garden and he knew what they were coming for, and he walked out to them and he said, I am he. He said, here I am, do to me what you came to do. He embraced death. He conquered death. And this evening, I believe that's why we don't need to fear death, is because Jesus embraced death and he conquered death. Any other comments? Any other discussion on the doctrine of death?
It kind of amazes me that Jesus was actually able to die because he's the source of life. When he went to go raise Lazarus to life, his presence, look what happened. Sure, Jesus spoke, but life was manifested to Lazarus again. Yet because of God's plan, God saw fit that Jesus would die. I don't question at all that Jesus did die, but to think that he is the source of life, and yet he still died.
Were they able to take his life, or did he lay it down?
He laid it down, according to the statement or elsewhere in John.
We know they crucified him. They did everything that man could do. But man technically could not take his life. Jesus laid down his life. I know sometimes we, wrongfully use the comment that they killed him. And that was their thought. That was what they meant to do, was to kill him. But technically they were powerless. He laid down his life. Probably that's why death is intertwined here with the other subjects here, and that's salvation and redemption. What is the meaning or the definition of salvation? If you had to explain it to somebody, what is the definition of salvation? Have you had a salvation experience?
Salvation is the means by which we have our burden of sin lifted.
And there's various aspects of, or meanings, I believe, that we could suggest here. There's a salvation experience, and that's not exactly what we're talking about here tonight. But salvation is in my definition, is deliverance of the soul from sin. And it's actually where I looked it up, it said in its consequences, but I put in there eternal consequences. Because salvation does not deliver us from some of the physical consequences of sin. We have those to deal with. But I believe it's the deliverance of the soul from sin and its eternal consequences. I open it up. Maybe that's partially correct and partially wrong. But immediately when man sinned, God already had a plan in place for salvation. And in Acts chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, it says, Be it known unto you all and to all the people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom ye crucified, whom God raised from the dead, even by him doth this man stand here before you whole. This is the stone which was set at naught of you builders, which is become the head of the corner. And then he says, Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. He had a plan, and that was Jesus Christ. that we could be saved from the eternal consequences of sin. Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, and to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." And that in a nutshell is the gospel, and that's Jesus Christ gave his life to deliver us. And we go right from, actually redemption, I believe as the heading would come underneath the heading of salvation, as redemption is a phase of that. Again, I'm asking you for a definition. What does redemption mean? And that one's fairly simple.
Buy back,
To buy back.
reclaim.
Interesting, you can read in Leviticus chapter 25, it gives us an illustration of earthly redemption. It says, "And in all the land of your possession ye shall grant a redemption for the land. If thy brother be waxen poor and hath sold away some of his possession, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then shall he redeem that which his brother sold." It's to buy back. And in that case, if a man was too poor, he couldn't buy it back himself, his brother could do it. How many of you have redeemed your brother spiritually? I don't have that verse written down here, but let's see. Bryce, would you look up Psalm 49? I believe it's verses 6 and 7. Some of you may have opportunity once in a while to redeem your brother in a physical way. You may be able to buy him out or pick him up. Go ahead, Bryce.
They that trust in their wealth and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches, none of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him.
So then, how can man be redeemed? What is the cost of redemption?
The precious blood of Jesus.
Hebrews 9:22 says, "And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission." Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." Most of us would understand that if it takes blood to redeem our brother, you can give your blood once. And that still wouldn't be adequate to redeem your brother, but none of us are capable. We can't do it. We can't pay the price of our redemption, nor can we redeem our brother. I think most of us have read lots of verses in Leviticus, all the blood that was shed. The price of redemption in the Old Testament, it covered, it was the blood of animals. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20 says, "For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." And as we well know, we've talked about it even here this evening, what that price was, and that was the blood of Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7 says, "In whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace." So now how does that tie in with the subject of death, salvation, redemption? I guess I asked the question, do we need to fear death? And the only reason we don't need to fear death tonight is because God's plan of salvation is redemption.
So how do you explain salvation to somebody who doesn't really believe in God? He believes in right and wrong, but not God. I had a discussion with one of the co-employees not too long ago, and he's the one that opened it up. I didn't start it, but anyhow. I come into the office in there, and he believes that there's aliens out there. But anyhow, we kind of brought this down to the fact of, I said, there's coming a day when every knee shall bow. His thing was question somewhat how I feel about, is this earth always going to continue to stand? I said, no. In reality, from the whole standpoint. Like, so I asked him the question, I said, do you believe in creation? He wanted this subject closed, okay? In essence, he'll answer that question if it stops there. He didn't want to go on. There was 2 other people in the office there too, and they decided it's best they probably leave. They didn't want to hear it. But I just let them know, in essence, you're either going to bow now or you're going to bow later. But how do you present salvation to somebody who does not really believe in God? His thing was, you have your beliefs, I have mine. That might be true, but that don't change the word. Now, we've been brought up with the Bible, and we know what it says, but somebody doesn't read the Bible, doesn't hardly know about it. So how do you convince them of salvation? I let them know I don't want to offend them, from that aspect. But you're not offending me. He wanted my opinion, so I gave it to him. But back to the question, how you can present salvation to somebody that really wants to know.
But you're talking about 2 different people. Somebody that wants to know and somebody that doesn't believe God, that there is a God.
Well, he believes in right and wrong, though, so how
But I don't think it's our responsibility to force someone to believe salvation.
Well, we can't force them.
That's right. But the best way is to live it and have it experienced. If they see something in our life that is different from the normal, even if they believe that in right or wrong, or to do good.
I guess my thought was most walls are broken down with one stroke. It's by demonstrating God's love in your life is the only way.
He happens to be the same individual that uses foul language occasionally, and when I come in his presence, he apologizes, which I don't know, I ever said anything to him about it, but does my life manifest enough that they know that's not really my life? I don't want to hear that kind of stuff. But back to the thing is, like, who gives your conscience? I let them know it's God.
Well, there's a lot more that could be said, but there's a purpose for our redemption. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14 says, "How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works." Anybody finish the verse? To serve the living God. That's why we've been redeemed. Any comments?
When you were talking about death, you were talking about physical death, but my mind kept going to where we need to come to. I think somebody mentioned death is the vehicle to God, and it is spiritual death. Death to ourselves is
right.
the vehicle to God. And you talked about redemption. We need to be lost before we can be redeemed, or lost before we can be saved. So, yeah, if we're good enough, if we know good and evil, but if we're good enough, we don't need salvation, we won't get it either.
Okay, thanks for your input. Thanks for your thoughts. Turn the time back to Caleb.